This is Vital Signs, a podcast on cutting-edge trends in health tech and the people shaping them. Today, we had a great conversation with Dr. Andy Beck, the CEO and co-founder of PathAI. Path's doing some fascinating work to take pathology data to improve diagnoses and treatments. The company was valued close to $1 billion recently, and Andy had a really interesting perspective on the state of AI adoption in pathology.
We think there will be quick adoption because it will make pathologists more accurate, more reproducible in the assessment of biopsies. Similarly, on oncology, we think it's going to be important for adoption to focus on things that pathologists are struggling with and that are critically important for treatment decisions.
Nailing go-to-market.
Our first go-to-market was drug development, working with biopharma for a number of different reasons, but one is it was just really good product market fits between what they need from their completed clinical trials, particularly initially, and what we can provide.
And why Path acquired their own lab.
We acquired a large anatomic pathology laboratory in 2021. We also set up a biopharma laboratory there, so now we can really service every set of customers.
I think you'll really enjoy our discussion. Andy, thanks so much for coming on.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, to start, I'd be curious, obviously you have no shortage of educational credentials. And as you were kind of navigating the early parts of your career, wondering how you decided to go into pathology in the first place. And obviously you were early to AI in pathology. What kind of got you interested in that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I guess, so for some personal history, my mother's a dermatologist and also trained in dermatopathology. So she took care of patients with skin conditions, and also kind of like a third of her job was doing pathology, so seeing those things biopsied and looked into the microscope. So I always thought like that seemed super interesting, and I remember even visiting her at work, and it's kind of magical, like the microscope and looking at these images, and like one person knows exactly what they're looking at. It's like the key information for each patient they're looking at, and like the other person, it's completely kind of like a random set of images that you have no idea what you're looking at. So I thought just this idea of interpreting images being key to guiding medical care was really interesting. And then kind of go ahead to medical school. I think the early years of medical school pathology, at least when I took it, played a really important role. Textbooks like Robbins' Pathologic Basis of Disease, I thought it like brought all of this stuff together into one field: genetics, immunology, cancer biology, cellular basis of disease. Like it kind of all comes together and seemed extremely rich and interesting, and something that could continue to be interesting going forward. And then, yeah, it really just fulfilled that in the clinical years. The idea of like looking at the primary document for each patient about what's really driving their disease, where it's both kind of scientifically gratifying, but also is one of the most important pieces of information kind of that a physician can deliver for guiding that patient's care. So it's kind of those combination of factors. So I actually went to it pretty early. It's one of the first things I really latched onto during medical school, and have kind of been doing it ever since.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then obviously I feel like you were, in the early days of actually applying kind of algorithms to, pathology. Maybe it's a good introduction to kind of just giving a brief context of like the history of providing more like quantitative methods on top of some of the qualitative work within pathology. And would love to hear kind of your journey through that to ultimately starting PathAI.
For sure. So one thing that was always super interesting about pathology, and I think every patient can relate to this, there's two big wings of it. There's clinical pathology and anatomic pathology. And each of us have certainly had results come back from each one. So you can think of pathology broadly as kind of like the laboratory basis of medicine. So something like 60 to 70% of medical decisions, and this is a big like $4 trillion market, are guided by some sort of laboratory result. Clinical pathology is largely blood-based work, and that over the years has been highly centralized, highly made objective, reproducible, standardized across the US and across the world, so that when you get, a glucose level or an LDL cholesterol at one lab, it's a quantitative number, and if you give that exact same sample to another lab, they have good ways of either making sure that's the same or identifying, when is it out of range. Then you take the other half of pathology, which is anatomic pathology, and largely what I've focused on both in my training but also at PathAI. That's this like very almost artistic, expert field that truly hasn't changed a lot in the practice of it in many decades. And that's where if you go to the doctor, and let's say they do a blood test and you're a man and you're 65 years old or something, and your PSA is elevated, your prostate-specific antigen, that's a quantitative test, but they're going to want to know, well, do you have prostate cancer? The only way to know that, to confirm the diagnosis, and this remains true today, it'll be true with blood-based markers and everything else, is you take a tissue biopsy And you take this physical piece of tissue out of the body, you embed it in a wax block, you cut thin sections on a microtome. You have these kind of 5-micron sections that are put under a microscope. And it really is a human today using our powers of perception to interpret what is going on in this image to make critical diagnoses like, do you have cancer, yes or no? And if you do, what's the grade and what's the severity of it? So that's very much the area of pathology we've worked on because, one, it's incredibly important for diagnoses of diseases like cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, and NASH. And two, it's really difficult to do objectively, reproducibly, scalably, as well as precision medicine continues to advance, to continue to advance that field to keep pace with the rate of progress in therapeutic development. So one, there's a big problem, a big opportunity here, I would say, because it is so important. And we've had this incredible transformation over the past decade in, computer vision. So I would say, back to your question, when did I start? I started very early. It was actually one of the first projects I worked on in medical school. We were doing a neural net back in essentially 2004 or so like 20 years ago. So I saw how bad it was back then. And the vision's been there for 50 or 60 or 70 years. Like, people have been trying to do this stuff. I would say 20 years ago I was trying, but it was so far removed from what a human could do. It was so artificial and costly. And then kind of I've been following in the field for 20 years. And yeah, the last 5 to 10 years has just been incredible.
And what do you say? I mean, obviously you've done a lot of academic research around, implementing these algorithms. Like, when did you decide, hey, like, this makes sense as a company and I'm going to go start, PathAI?
Yeah, it was a couple things. So one, I had been in the field for a while. So I'd say we started the company in 2016. So I'd probably already been thinking about these problems for like a decade, and had seen kind of where they were, what was state of the art before deep learning. And then, the big advance in deep convolutional neural nets in computer vision were around 2012. And this was a very different application area, but just sort of showing that, wow, this is incredibly better than anything before. And then it wasn't a fake. It was like year over year, these systems were getting incrementally better to the point where for many applications around the 2016 timeframe, computer vision systems were outperforming humans for similar tasks. And this just like hadn't been true for, if you look back a decade, the joke was always a 3-year-old is better than a system trained by like 36 PhD scientists with hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was very disheartening, I think, to some people in the field. That all changed around the 2015 timeframe. So that was one big thing. And the other was just a couple other big sort of secular forces, like cloud computing was a huge advance. And then digital pathology overall, it was clear that that was going to mature and ultimately gain widespread adoption. So not just creating images on a microscope that eventually, are just gone once you're done looking at them, but actually taking a big picture, creating a permanent, inexhaustible digital resource of every image so that a human can analyze it, but also in the future, algorithms can analyze it. So it's really those three things: increasing availability of digital data through digital pathology, the incredible advances in deep convolutional neural nets, and cloud computing. And then it was just a good time for me to really I was at a point in my career where I wanted to try something new and, saw this big problem that could be solved and big opportunity. So that was kind of the personal and the sort of things in the field that came together for starting the company when we did.
Totally. And then when you got started, I mean, I imagine, to your earlier point, I mean, there's so many different conditions that anatomic pathologists work in, whether it's cancer, inflammatory bowel, NASH. Like, how did you kind of decide where to start?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would say one thing we started, and still an important theme in the company, is what's not going to change? What's robust to support all of these end use cases? And kind of when thinking about a company and applications and building a platform, you kind of want it wide enough in scope, but kind of strategically to be narrow enough that you invest heavily and triple down on something, and then it will hit a wide enough scope. So you don't want to make the market too small. You obviously don't want to try to boil the ocean. So the good thing here is there's something that's very static and robust across all these applications, and that's these whole slide images of tissue that are a certain size and of certain characteristics that are used by pathologists for all these different conditions. So one is really thinking about a technology platform and user-facing interfaces that will cover the full spectrum as like a first area to invest in. So not just focusing on specific applications, like we're going to go after early stage ER-positive breast cancer and throw all of our attention there, and that may not at all be transferable to late stage or lung cancer. We wanted to focus on what's going to cover everything where tissue histopathology is important, and that included the technology platform, the interface for research, for clinical trials, for clinical practice. as well as the ability to generate very large, well-annotated training data sets, and of course the machine learning capabilities to predict what are the cells in the image, what are the tissue in the images, can I predict molecular phenotypes from the images, can I predict patient outcomes and treatment response from the images. All of that, those methodologies are very general across those use cases. And then we really did focus, okay, now that we've got this platform and machinery, how do we prioritize which algorithm products to go after? And I can talk more about that, but that's really how we've thought about it. Technology and platform first, then algorithm products are prioritized after that.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, I imagine there's a lot of common workflows that you'd want to build across the board for pathologists, and then also, just kind of integrating with the set of tools they're using in the first place. Having the ability to surface folks on the trial side. That common set of infrastructure makes a ton of sense. I imagine when you were deciding, initial use cases to go after, a big part too was, just where training data was available, right? Like, I'm actually curious. I'd imagine, when you were starting the company in 2016. My impression, at least, is there wasn't a ton of this that was digitized, right? And there wasn't like these massive data sets that already existed. But how did you go about even getting these training data sets in the first place?
Sure. I say it's an interesting, that could have been the way to do it, but I would say sometimes I think that can mislead you. Because then, it could be data sets for a problem that's just not valuable. And I do think that's happened. And I would say we've tried to prioritize with a different framework and then really focus on getting the targeted data sets that are needed to solve that problem, versus sort of saying this data happens to be available and using that to drive the application. And I think the biggest things we've thought about, so one, something that's truly actionable, where the pathology diagnosis and the precision diagnosis really makes a difference. Because actually a lot of things just don't matter that much. For example, imagine you have a small tumor on your skin and it gets cut out and there's no other treatment option, and you're definitely going to cut this thing out because it's just that what the pathologist says is useful in some way, but it's not critical because the procedure's already being done. You're not going to just leave it, and you're not going to give chemotherapy or something, so that it's not actual. So it's focusing on where the pathology really is the critical information for guiding an important medical decision for patients. So that's one. Number two, where pathologists are struggling and where there's an opportunity to really improve in a significant way, where you could actually then cause a change in the way the workflow is happening today. And then tied to two is some evidence that machine learning will effectively solve this problem. And then third, kind of prioritizing based on the markets that will address the most number of patients and really have the biggest impact in both drug development or in diagnostics. So that's kind of the framework. And once you do that, actually targetedly getting data is the easier problem to some degree, because one big advantage of our platform is it's based on whole site images coming from glass slides, which are being created at large scale every single day for patients undergoing routine procedures across the US and across the world. So it's really asking the questions, having the vision of what the product is in mind, and then target going after that data. And of course, there's multiple types of data that are useful. There's the images, but then there's sort of the annotation from experts. And we focused heavily on both and really building large collections of data, but also a very large set of expertly trained pathologists connected through our platform to help annotate those images, and we use both of those for training our models.
Yeah, and to start, did you have to basically find some provider partnerships or pathologists that were willing to kind of share their images with you, and then you kind of built a network of expert annotators?
Exactly. Yeah. So and starting from the beginning, we started with partnerships with academic medical center laboratories, independent laboratories, hospitals. As well as about 2 years ago, we acquired our own laboratory that also has a large source of data. So all of those are valuable sources of data to help train these models.
Yeah. No, I want to get into that because I think it's a super interesting, a thing that you guys did, in acquiring your own laboratory. I imagine when you started the business, there were so many different go-to-markets you could have gone down, right? There was obviously the opportunity to, sell directly to, providers and systems. There was the opportunity to sell to pharma, the opportunity to sell to insurers that want better care. And then, there was this also, I imagine, do you partner with labs? Do you acquire, and it seems like you guys have kind of dual, I think the answer is probably that your go-to-market is a combination of a lot of these things, but I'm wondering, where you initially started and how it's kind of evolved over the course of the business.
For sure. Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, for all these, timing is so important, and kind of controlling what you can control, controlling market development that you can control, but also working with the adoption curves that are external to the company and really timing go-to-market. And it's not just adoption, it also has to do with reimbursement timing as well as regulatory timing for putting all these pieces together to how do you really continue growing sustainably over time. And I would say that was probably the topic we thought of most, and the biggest strategic question certainly in the early days of the company. And we did consider all of those options at the beginning. We considered, do we just want to be kind of the Intel Inside for large diagnostics companies, which was another one you didn't mention, but that was one of the initial considerations. Do we want to provide this sort of technology-enabled service to biopharma? Do we want to set up our own lab just ourselves from scratch, kind of a startup lab? There are many startup companies who do start labs. Usually it's for some kind of specialty testing, but we could have gone that route and then marketed directly to physicians, or we could have been a technology platform to sell into labs. And kind of we started first, and I would definitely say our first go-to-market was very much, and still remains a super important central part of our business, is drug development, working with biopharma. It's for a number of different reasons, but one is it was just really good product market fit between what they need from their completed clinical trials, particularly initially, and what we can provide, and the ability for them to have, every large top 20 major pharma is running hundreds of clinical trials and spending billions, over 10 billion for certain large companies on research and development. So it's incredibly important that they understand why these patients in trials are responding or failing to respond to therapies, to get the most value out of these trials, and to help them provide the basis of data for designing either later stage trials for programs that are continuing, or new combinations or new sets of trials. So that was one where there was clearly a real need, and that our technology could really deliver, because it is fundamentally a machine learning problem, is understanding, we have this set of data where we have treatment on every patient, outcome on every patient, and pathology images on every patient. How do you use the images to predict the treatment response, and how can you use that to identify novel biomarkers or novel patient subsets? So that was a really great place for us to start. It remains a very important part of our business, and that was one that we could really start scaling relatively quickly with solving problems for our first partner and then extending that to additional partners. And it's also a very concentrated market, so you don't need a huge distributed sales force to target a large portion of the market.
I imagine you're kind of in the early stages of clinical development there, and so it's possible as you identify these biomarkers, well then you guys become part of just a companion diagnostic or standard of care ultimately for those therapeutics. And then I also imagine it obviously, like to your point, there's much more centralization on the pharma side than it sounds like there is on like the anatomic pathologist side. And so if the pharma companies are getting this data anyway, it's a really interesting way to just be able to find a few of those versus did you guys try what's the kind of effort been like distributing to the maybe more fragmented side of providers out there?
Yeah, so I'd say that was the first big focus of the business, and it remains a very important part. We've extended from sort of the exploratory translational research to being able to deploy our systems prospectively in clinical trials, as well as to support companion diagnostic development. So that was kind of, even within pharma, the time course of where we focused. And now, for companion diagnostics to truly be successful and transform medicine, they have to be widely available in this highly fragmented, distributed market. And the technology we're building off of is widely available and highly distributed. The histology equipment to create the slides, digital pathology scanners are being more widely distributed. Luckily, the cloud is also widely distributed. So it really is sort of supplementing all of that and adding in our image management system, our viewer, and our algorithms. And to really, that's the core of the strategy is both, and that they're very synergistic. You're distributing novel algorithms into practice, and then the models over time will get better, and you'll acquire more data from many more patients, and then that feeds into even better services to advance drug development. And I would say our foray into that market was one, and we've done this with both pharma, with drug development and in diagnostics, is to have both a centralized and a distributed model to take advantage of the advantages of both. And we acquired a large anatomic pathology laboratory in 2021. We also set up a biopharma laboratory there. So now we can really service every set of customer. Ones who are already digital through just giving out our digital platform, ones who have the capability to make glass slides, so they can send their glass slides to us to digitize. And even if they don't have any histology capabilities, we can receive tissue to process histologically, digitize, and then apply algorithms. So we're really both on the drug development as well as diagnostic side, having both this central lab model, but also distributed technology platform model allows us to have access to the full market. And it was really just this year that we've started to deploy our technology platform called AI Site into labs and hospitals around folks starting in the US, but now we're actually doing a lot of work in Europe as well, ultimately expanding that to rest of world. So it was a lot about timing, but ultimately I think both is the winning model. There's a lot you can do yourself and really optimize things internally and then distribute through the distributed technology platform widely.
That was interesting. It sounds like AI site, works well, when you can get pathologists to adopt the set of things you need to digitize, the inputs. So just to go into a bit more detail there, like what do you actually, from like a behavior change or like equipment change perspective, like what do you kind of need a pathologist lab to have in order to, be able to just kind of provide the software and algorithms on top?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty is they don't need, because of the unique setup we have, we can service any customer any pathologist who's interested in using the AI site platform. And on one extreme, they're in a lab that's already digital and already has basically the histology equipment, the staining equipment. They also have a whole site imaging system, and then that image can be uploaded into AI site. But the other extreme is just say a pathologist who's operating, who's operating by themselves, say in their office, and they don't even have histology equipment, but they're connected to a physician's practice. That physician can send tissue to our own lab. We can do the histology, create the glass, do it digital, and then serve it through the web back to this pathologist wherever they're sitting, and they can access AI site in their office and sign out there. So we can really offer the service to the full set of pathologists, from fully digitally enabled to not digitally enabled at all, beyond having a monitor and an internet connection.
And so as part of the impetus behind that, like basically the idea that, look, it might take a long time before the vast majority of pathology offices like adopt this digital equipment.
Absolutely, yes. So if it were like as mature as say like cell phones or something that are widely distributed, you just like update an app and push it out to everyone. Yeah, I think it would be the model. It would definitely be a different market and a different potential timing around the go-to-market. There's still advantages to operating the end-to-end workflow in a single site in terms of the research and development side and fully optimizing the full workflow beyond the algorithm. You can also do that through partnership, but there are advantages to controlling the whole process internally prior to the distribution.
And so will you take, obviously, part of the model is that folks can send in glass slides, but will you also take kind of like initial reads yourself? Like, do you guys end up being like a referral partner for folks that refer out to pathology? And does that do you kind of compete with some of the pathologists you also support?
That's a question that comes up. I mean, the short answer is no. Like we really want to support, all the physicians that are sending the specimens, regardless of where they're sending it, whether they're sending it to us or sending it to other labs. I mean, in theory, you could say some of the pathology labs, there could be some physician practices that we're both trying to get the business from, but truly we want to either enable them or do the end-to-end work ourselves. And we've found, the market is very large, very distributed, so we really don't see that interaction happen very often. And our goal is really to just really support, advancing the field and use of the technology so that AI site and our algorithms are most widely used, regardless of whether it's through our own lab or through a partner lab.
That makes a ton of sense. And I guess, I'm sure something you guys thought about a lot from the beginning is just how these algorithms interface with, the pathologists themselves and kind of the human in the loop versus, pure diagnosis model. And I think probably a good, introduction to just talk a little bit about how regulation works for these algorithms today and how you guys thought about like the right way to structure, what you guys do to fit into that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question just because you said how it's a spectrum and there's no kind of at all one size fits all. And the algorithm itself is even just one part of the overall device that you're considering. So we very much think about what is the context of use, how is this being used? To your question, what's the role of the pathologist? What are some of the risk mitigators if the system is making mistakes? Is there a special control, which in many cases would be a pathologist? And we follow the regulatory path that fits for each one, and we really do the full spectrum. So a lot of our exploratory research is sort of fully automated systems in the sense that the input is whole site images, the outputs are spreadsheets full of data that then are used by the scientists. And there's QC and quality control, but in general, not every single case has to be reviewed by a pathologist prior to the data being returned for certain use cases. There's other use cases in research that are highly regulated, and a pathologist is the special control on every single case. And then on the clinical side, our view is everything we're building has a pathologist as a special control, as a person with the ultimate judgment, as the person who has to ultimately give the final diagnosis. And we are in general aiming to be kind of one component that helps pathologists in the field make the right diagnosis. But what the pathologist's judgment is doing will depend on the case. Like, is this a human interpretable output, in which case they can contribute quite a bit? Or is this some sort of phenotype that can only be read by a machine, in which case they're doing more quality control on the overall system? You could imagine in the same way in clinical pathology or in genetic testing, it's sort of more quality control versus making the primary interpretation, because for certain cases like reading a nucleotide, a human can't make the primary interpretation. And for some of the features we're measuring for certain, they really can't be read in any other way. So those are some of the factors that help determine the regulatory path. In terms of PathAI specifically, we have 510K clearance for our viewer is one regulatory clearance we've had in the past couple years, and we are working on one other regulated device, particularly in the drug development setting, that we're in advanced stages with.
Yeah. I mean, given that you on the clinical side that you use the pathologist as special control, like what does that, I guess, mean? So every time you have a new algorithm, if you start in cancer and then you go into NASH or whatnot, like, do you have to, how does the regulatory timeline work around that? And, from, I guess, when you started the business in 2016, like, how long did it take, from a regulatory side to say, okay, you can go, implement this on the clinical side?
Yeah. So on the clinical side, there's a few different regulatory frameworks. There's the five, like for example, we have 510K clearance on our platform for primary diagnosis. And then yes, for each new algorithm product, a decision will be made for how that's going to be used. Is it going to be an FDA cleared diagnostic device, or is it more of a research use only tool that won't go through FDA regulatory clearance? And laboratories are also regulated largely by CAP/CLIA guidelines, and laboratories, can validate tests under those guidelines. So it's a significant decision for us, just based on the time and cost and level of rigor for specific applications for deciding which algorithm products off of our large set we want to submit for regulatory clearance, and we certainly do that when required to make the most impactful product.
Totally. I mean, I guess I'm curious, like taking a step back, obviously algorithms in pathology just make so much sense. It's something you focus, your majority of your career on. Like, how would you kind of characterize where we are today in terms of, what these models can do well, where there's still a lot of work to be done? What's kind of the state of the field today?
Yeah, so I think we're still at the beginning of the sort of well-validated, robust sets of products. I think there's been such huge advances just these past couple of years in machine learning that, like, I've never been more bullish on kind of where the technology is. And my mind is blown by just how well these systems work today or can work. So I think that's like really exciting and kind of, I've thought from the beginning, but it's even more true now, anything that's visual by eye is going to be able to be done even better with machine learning, augmenting a pathologist and a pathologist alone. So that's a pretty big chunk of pathology. And I think if there's two big areas, one is making what we can already see today and the biomarkers we know are important today more accurate, more reproducible. And that's actually big, and people forget about the importance of both. We focus a lot on accuracy. Accuracy is important. Reproducibility and noise is also really important. So just getting rid of noise, getting rid of variability. If you send a case to a pathologist in Wyoming or a pathologist in Boston or California, to have confidence you're going to get the same diagnosis every time would be a huge advance for the field. So for that, I think technically we're far, and I think a lot of the work today is creating the right workflows that integrate into the clinical practice of the pathology community to really start increasing the utilization of both digital and AI. So I think the field is moving very fast. We're at a stage where the technology's there. We're getting our first high quality algorithm products. And then, the next big stage will be the integration into practice. And I think for everything in this first category, like AI augmented pathology will be superior to pathology alone. And I always want to make this point because it's so true. They're not either or. Yeah.
For like everything a pathologist is kind of diagnosing, does it feel like today we have algorithms that are already kind of, could help a lot in that diagnosis? Or are there some spaces where it's still been challenging to kind of build those models?
I think it's been challenging in a sense that people haven't focused on them. So I'd say the answer is no. I think pathologists do such an incredibly large set of different tasks. I don't think it's necessarily for things that are visible by eye a technical barrier. I think it's you have to focus on things, for example, that fulfill those three criteria I mentioned. Things where the machine learning augmented pathologist is going to be significantly better than pathologists alone, things that are actionable and really address unmet medical need, and markets that are big enough that if you make this investment, it's going to address a significant number of patients. So I think that's the prioritization, and a lot of things haven't hit that level for each of those three. So I don't think it's technical. I just think it's where people focus, and there aren't that many companies in this area, particularly companies who are building these things really high quality, really robust, and then have platforms that are distributed to actually get them to pathologists. So you do have to prioritize and, look ahead 5 or 10 years. Absolutely, I think the majority. But now I think it's just people, including us, are focusing on what are the most important applications, then we'll be adding more and more over time. And then the second big area is just what's not being done today, but would benefit patients if it were being done. And that's really discovering new biomarkers, discovering new subsets of patients using this technology. And we're at the very early stages there as well. I mean, I see in the future where this technology is being used in every clinical trial. So we're discovering many new important patient subsets who will benefit from specific therapeutic interventions. And that sort of use of this technology for discovery and then new biomarkers, new companion diagnostics, that's still quite early.
Yeah. And how does that work on the discovery side? I'm sure it's a combination of these two, but is that process more like hypothesis driven where you guys are kind of digging into potential areas, or is it like a total unstructured problem where you're like, let's just look at a bunch of, these slides and clinical outcomes and draw our own conclusions?
Yeah. I mean, the really cool thing is we can do the full spectrum of that. So with the technology, and what's so unique about this approach is you have these inexhaustible images. So there's really no cost in terms of tissue. There's some cost in terms of computer processing, but that's getting cheaper over time and is still extremely relatively cheap compared to the value it could provide. So we absolutely do both. I think one thing that's unique about PathAI is that we cover the full spectrum from fully interpretable, this is the standard biomarker, but now we can measure it more accurately, more reproducibly, more objectively. How good is this biomarker? And that's our baseline. And then we can actually do more, say, end-to-end type deep learning approaches where the only sort of knowledge we're imposing on the system ahead of time, an extreme example would be just the images and the treatment and the outcome, and say, discover. And then we have this whole set of intermediates, which actually often work the best, where we're imposing some knowledge, some prior knowledge, like cells are important, tissue regions are important. But we're saying we don't know what are the spatial patterns, what are the characteristics of each, is it nuclear features, is it others? So let's use deep learning to discover those novel patterns from the data. So to go from a single biomarker that you just measure more accurately and reproducibly, sort of discovery of novel spatial phenotypes, and then kind of the pure end-to-end approach, it's very powerful to be able to do that full spectrum and then benchmark results. And then you often end up with the strongest predictive model that you could then say take into a later stage trial or to help design a new trial.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think one thing you mentioned too is obviously, the underlying models and just tech across the industry has gotten better and better. And obviously we're in like kind of an AI hype cycle right now. And, I'm curious, like there's obviously been these huge advances in underlying foundation models and kind of just general purpose models, right? I think even in the computer vision space, you had the Meta team with their segment anything model. And it feels like across the board, these multi-billion parameter generalist models are getting better and better. Does that influence like your day-to-day work at all? Or is it still like, the same models you guys were building before these massive multi-billion parameter models are still the most relevant?
It absolutely influences our work tremendously today. And I think these are like super real advances and makes us able to be far more efficient with our use of resources and much more productive by, using foundation models where you have these very large models. So fewer models, but more parameters per model, but certainly each model trained on more data and far more generalizable. So the issue in pathology, the area we're at, is there's many relatively small applications. Taken together, it's a huge set. It's a huge market, a huge set of applications, but each one is relatively narrow. So if you do have to have a full development process for each one, and there's really no synergy between them, it becomes extremely costly, both in terms of time and money to do that. Whereas if you can start with a foundation model and really just do fine-tuning as needed with very little additional training for each new application, that's very, very powerful. And that's something we're absolutely doing and has been leveraging a lot of the recent advances more generally in computer vision. And you mentioned segment anything model. I mean, things like that, like Facebook, showed can dramatically scale and increase the speed at which and reduce the cost of getting supervised annotations for training downstream supervised models. And we're absolutely incorporating advances like that into our process, because I do think we're seeing sort of orders of magnitude shift in productivity and decrease in cost based on leveraging some of these new approaches.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I feel like there's this question of like the extent to which you'll have generalizability across these massive models, and if you're seeing that already in pathology, I mean that seems like one of the hardest use cases for these models to be able to generalize across. And obviously, I'm sure there's a ton of fine tuning you do on each specific use case, but even just the model learning, being able to transfer learnings in one place to another is really exciting. I mean, to your point, given the long tail of smaller use cases within pathology, they may not have the clear ROI that like the first few you went after do. It's awesome to hear that they may require less kind of compute and novel work to spin up in the first place.
For sure. I mean, part of it's because we've, over the years, we're in our 7th year now, I've developed a very large corpus of data to enable us to build these foundation models, like massive sets of whole slide images, massive numbers of annotations from pathologists. We have over 450 pathologists sort of providing us with annotations. We have access to over 50 million sort of whole slides that can be imaged. And so, yeah, once you have this very large corpus of data, and that's not like widely available public data. So once you have a very sort of narrow, vertical, wide corpus of data, yeah, you can build foundation models that will then generalize across quite a large number of tasks within that domain. So I do think that's kind of where things are going. I'm not sure these general models build on entirely different images, but I do think in different verticals, those who can accumulate large data sets of enough scale will then be able to build these foundation models that will cover many of the applications within a vertical.
Totally. And, I think, part of what I think is really interesting about what you're doing too is, to maybe the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how, a lot of pathologist work is relatively qualitative today. And, you have folks that have been doing it for a while and can really nail these diagnoses, but maybe it's harder to transfer to newer folks in the space. And I think, one thing you guys, I believe, have focused on is kind of this pathomics work of standardizing, some of the measures for these diagnoses. I'd love to hear a bit more about that and, how you've thought about getting them adopted in the industry at large.
Yeah, no, so I think it's so important to sort of build off the shoulders of all of the knowledge that has been gained, as a great place where this technology can be valuable. And in many cases, we are measuring the right biomarkers or biomarkers that are very valuable. It's just that they're so difficult to measure based on just how complex the underlying biology is and just the sort of intrinsic challenges of human perception, which is essentially some kind of generative model. Every time we look at something, we're not exactly seeing exactly what's there. We're doing heuristics to see only small parts of the image because they're so dense. And we're kind of creating different results, different times we see it. And that's why there's, for difficult things, significant levels of both within observer variability and inter-observer variability. So it's not that we're measuring the wrong thing. It's not even that we're inaccurate across a large number of people. There's just too much variability within viewer, and that there's different biases within different viewers. So some people may just systematically be low, and some people are systematically high. So if you average over both, it looks like you're near the middle. But for any individual patient, they may be getting something systematically off based on which pathologist. And even if they show an image to that same pathologist on 2 separate days, for many very difficult things, they'll get a different answer. So this is a great opportunity for machine learning, which can be trained to be both accurate and is always essentially reproducible in the sense that the same image, a model deployed on the same image will give exactly the same result to the same image. So we focused on this in many areas. I would say oncology, some of our work around PD-L1, which is probably the most important tissue-based biomarker for immuno-oncology, HER2, which is the most important biomarker that's emerged in this new area of antibody-drug conjugates, and it's critical in a number of tumor types, accurately and reproducibly interpreting PD-L1 and HER2. And then another major area for us has been in non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, is making more accurate and reproducible the assessment of inflammation, diseased liver cells called ballooning hepatocytes, amount of fat, and amount of fibrosis. So each of these are somewhat subjective and difficult to score reproducibly by manually. So we've trained a machine learning system to aid the pathologist in scoring these more accurately and reproducibly. And in terms of adoption, I mean, on the drug development side, we focus on areas where this data is critical for drug development. So, for example, the NASH example, the pathology scoring is super critical for enrolling trials and for assessing histologic endpoints. So, and we're working with the FDA and the EMA to get regulatory qualification for use of this tool in trials. And we think there will be quick adoption because it will make pathologists more accurate, more reproducible in the assessment of these biopsies. Similarly, on oncology, we think it's going to be important for adoption to focus on things that pathologists are struggling with and that are critically important for treatment decisions. And 2 examples of that would be PD-L1 in immuno-oncology and HER2 for these new HER2 antibody-drug conjugate therapies.
Yeah. I mean, given all the things we've discussed, I'm curious, as you think 5-10 years in the future, how does the job of pathologist change? What looks different on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot of these kind of lower level tasks, like counting individual cells or trying to make quantitative assessments of this image data. I think a lot of that work will be done sort of behind the scenes by the AI systems. So you sort of picture now a slide undergoes in an automated fashion, an H&E stain or an immunohistochemistry stain, and then that becomes the raw input that the pathologist has to look at, and then they're essentially doing a very low-level task to interpret, how many immune cells are here, how many cells are expressing this protein brown, how many are negative. And they're doing their best with these sort of heuristics, but they're being provided with very unstructured raw data. So I definitely think the future job of the anatomic pathologist is you're not going to end with the H&E stain and the IHC stain. You will be augmenting the H&E with AI. You'll be augmenting the IHC with AI. The pathologist will be sitting down in front of a monitor that will have a sophisticated AI system that sort of looked at the patient's medical history, looked at the medical literature, looked at what's going on in the image, and made a set of different recommendations, each with different potential trade-offs. This is what I think the diagnosis is. This is what I think the best treatment recommendation is. And then I think the pathologist's job really will be a lot more higher level judgment, data integration, thinking through these different recommendations, and then really becoming the physician's physician, leveraging all of that to say, this is the diagnosis I go for, and really talking through these are the different treatment, recommendations to then talk to, say, the treating oncologist, the treating gastroenterologist, who ultimately then will summarize that to help be a good consultant and physician for the patient to make the right treatment decision. I think that will be a big part of the work for some of the most difficult work, and that may actually turn into the majority of the work. I think there'll be certain types of cases in the future, that are very straightforward, where the AI is doing most of the work and the pathologist is sort of doing quality control and approving the case. So I think in general, a much larger proportion of their time will be focused on sort of judgment, data integration, and really helping focus on the most difficult cases.
Super interesting. I mean, obviously, we're in the early innings of digital pathology today, but I feel like already, you guys have done a ton on both the research side and the clinical side. I'm curious, of all the things you've done, is there a piece of work that you're particularly proud of, of the impact you guys have had?
Yeah, so it's hard to focus on just one. So I would say in terms of the application area, I think NASH is a really great example of an area where there's a huge unmet patient need. It's a huge growing medical problem. There's an unmet drug development need in the sense that it's been very challenging to get effective new therapies approved, partly because of how difficult the pathology part of clinical trials is. And it's something we've been focusing on for about 4 years now, is building a platform both for new biomarker discovery, but also for more accurate, reproducible measures of the key features of NASH. And we really think this will transform the way drug development happens in this area. And then that very specific area, I think, really becomes an example for how this could expand widely across areas of tissue pathology and the way it's used in drug development. So I would say the work on our NASH Explore product and our AIM NASH product are some of the product areas that are real highlights.
That's awesome. Well, we always like to wrap up our interviews with kind of a quick fire round where we ask you some questions for your takes. And so maybe to start, what are you most excited about in AI and healthcare completely outside of the work you're doing at PathAI?
Yeah, so I think there's this huge opportunity for this idea of kind of personal health assistants that are really with patients a lot, whether they're doing preventative health and they're overall healthy, or even if they have a serious condition in, say, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, psychiatric disease. But there's just this great disconnect between what it's like living with one of these diseases and the way medical care is given today. And it's so suboptimal, where I think this idea of having, large language models and intelligent systems that are actually responding to feedback in real time and providing feedback and encouragement and coaching back to people to allow them to more effectively prevent disease or treat serious diseases they already have. And that can, I think, incorporate a lot of different things, including sort of compliance with medication, compliance with other recommendations, and make it really empowering for people. Because the whole cliche of like you go to the doctor and they give a serious diagnosis and you like can't remember a thing they said. And like the solution today is like a piece of paper that's very static and has a few things on it. But what if you had kind of like a real-time partner for dealing with these diseases that are super chronic? So this is entirely outside of pathology, but I think there's tremendous opportunity here.
Totally. I mean, I feel like you're already, I feel like for a while there was a bunch of these companies that were trying to do automated scribing, like recording visits in doctors' offices and putting that into notes. And the tech didn't really work. And now it actually really seems like it does. And, I think there's, even tremendous potential there to record a doctor's visit. And then, these models are very good at kind of summarizing or explaining things at different sophistication levels, right? Whether it's back to, the patient, then to a referring physician, to whoever it is. I think that's a really exciting part of the space today. And then obviously, you spent the last 7 years, getting, AI and healthcare adopted in the system. I'm wondering if you had a magic wand and you could make a change to like the broader health system or the regulation, what change would you make to kind of speed up adoption of AI in the space?
Yeah, so I think I talked kind of about my my specific space. Definitely in healthcare, reimbursement and financial incentives are such an important way of driving change. So there's definitely increased costs associated with things like buying digital pathology scanners. There's more and more data coming out showing the improved quality of diagnoses. Diagnoses have a tremendous healthcare impact overall in terms of being the key piece of information for determining downstream therapeutic decisions. So I think a reimbursement framework for this technology that really recognized the value of increased accuracy, increased reproducibility, and getting patients with serious diseases on the right therapy that was sort of specifically considering the latest advances in AI would have a tremendous impact. So I think it would likely be that. And I think more broadly, the sort of move from sort of fee for service and service units being generic to really being able to recognize and incentivize use of technology that will increase the quality of care would be tied to that.
Totally. No, it's a really good point. I mean, I feel like a lot of the way, codes work today is it's around the amount of work it takes for a provider to do. And so actually, when you introduce some of these algorithms and it takes less work, even though it's better for the system and you're getting better results, you may end up with lower actual reimbursement for that. And so it feels like you're right. If you have kind of more of a value-based paradigm, you would be able to avoid that kind of unfortunate reality of the go-to-market there. And then, another thing I wanted to hit is I believe, if I'm correct, that when you were a PhD student, you were in Daphne Koller's lab?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So one, is it true that all very successful people in health tech just know each other because the world seems stupidly small? But two, I'd love to hear a bit about what that was like.
Yeah, no, what a great group of people to work with. What was it like? It was great. It was one of the, certainly a key to the trajectory that I've kind of been on ever since. So when I went there, I had already done my pathology residency, and I kind of really liked machine learning and computer science, but just hadn't done it even in college. So I was kind of like, oh, this is my last chance to really dive in completely and learn this new subject. And then, of course, I wanted something that would somehow leverage. I wasn't going to be like the world's greatest programmer or the world's greatest algorithm developer just because I hadn't done much of it. But I was kind of in a unique position where I could, I have some pathology knowledge. I could link that with knowledge in machine learning and hopefully do something useful at the interface. And then, Daphne was one. She was very generous for taking me on just because I did have such a different background. Like she's got the strongest technical computer science, algorithm, machine learning folks. That's definitely wasn't where I was coming from, although I really wanted to get deep in that area. But she saw the value in sort of, the medical applications. And so it was just super generous of her to take me on. And I think reflects her sort of her spirit of wanting to go into something new and really make an impact. And yeah, she was just an incredible mentor and person to train with, both her and the people in her group, in the sense of always wanting to push as far as you can in terms of really doing impactful work work that's important. It's not just, incrementally better than what came before, but it's really a significant advance for the field. It did enable me to learn all of the kind of state of the art, at least learn it as an observer that's happening in machine learning, and then try to apply some subset of that to the problem I was working on. And I think, that became the basis for really, a lot of the same values I've continued to try to apply when I was in academia and into the work at PathAI. So it's definitely a super formative experience.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like you're kind of living up to having that impacted more with the work you're doing today. I mean, Andy, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure folks will want to dig into all sorts of different threads we had here. What's the best way for them to learn more about you and kind of the work you guys are doing at PathAI?
Yeah, so definitely check out our website. We keep that updated, as well as LinkedIn and Twitter. We're always updating both with new advances. If you want to reach out to me, Andy Beck at pathai.com. Always happy to meet new people.
Amazing. Well, Andy, thanks so much. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.